Contact Center KPI podcast. We have Aaron Slavin with us today. He has 10 years running compliance in call centers, and we're going to be talking about some different types of stuff today. And so I just want to let everybody know, the purposes of this podcast are purely informational. The topics we're going to be discussing today are not to be construed as legal advice. Definitely, if this is interesting to you and these are topics that you struggle with, I would definitely encourage you to talk with your general counsel about this and seek professional legal advice. Aaron and I are not attorneys, so we're going to keep things very high level, kind of talk about ideas, topics, strategies, things like that. But Aaron, please take a moment to introduce yourself.
Hey, Greg, thank you for having me. This is fun. My name's Aaron Slavin. I most recently worked for Protect My Car in St. Petersburg, Florida. As you said, Greg, I ran their internal department of compliance for about 9.5 years. And prior to that, I did practice criminal law for about 10 years as well. I was on both sides of the aisle there. I did about 6 years with the state prosecutor in Florida, did some cool gang-related cases, and went to the defense side, did about 4 years of defense work before switching to in-house compliance.
So what we're going to talk about today is balancing agent-employee safety against kind of business operation and profitability. And so we're going to kind of venture outside of our typical KPIs, kind of focusing on. And a couple months ago, I had an interesting conversation with Aaron, and some of the struggles and some of the things that he was being faced with on a daily basis really kind of like caught my attention as like, oh, these are real world challenges that I don't think often get discussed. It's kind of like the not fun thing to talk about when you start talking about call centers. And so after our conversation, Aaron, I realized like it's actually a bigger problem than I even realized. I was on with a customer today, and they were talking about people threatening to kill themselves to agents. It was a debt collection company. And I was like, this is crazy. So Aaron, kind of let's back up a little bit, right? Let's give our listeners some context because we're talking about people killing themselves to agents. Like, what are some of the things that you struggled with? Let's start with some context and kind of focused on trying to help when in a previous life, help with in a previous life.
No, I appreciate the question. And what we had discussed in November was, as part of running a call center, especially, in my particular industry, was vehicle service contracts or extended warranty. But I would think this applies to the greater insurance world as well. You're dealing with thousands of customers. You're dealing with heated issues. You're dealing with claims that could be worth a lot of money. And, you're going to get disgruntled customers, angry customers, and that's putting aside one of the segments of our business was also a rather large call center. So, we have agents making outbound calls, talking to prospects, trying to sell a product, and a lot of people that you get them on a bad day, they don't want to be called. And so what we experienced was, a number of situations where either our individual agents were threatened. We've had to investigate death threats to individual agents. We've had bomb threats in our building where customers have provided our exact address and mentioned that there was a bomb in the building, and other sort of, risky or dangerous employee related issues. So what I was asked to do in our compliance department by our management team was create kind of a threat matrix internally. We called it a threat team, and we needed to have a plan in place, and in terms of how do we review these incidents, to find out whether they're credible or not. When do we contact law enforcement, and how do we balance the safety of our employees and our staff with the, real world practicality of trying to run a business?
Yeah. Was Was there a moment when that kind of realization happened that, hey, we need to have this threat team, or was it kind of a slow buildup? Like, what was that turning point where, as a business, you decide it's time to invest in this?
Um, I think as things started to escalate and as we would start to review some of these calls, reports had to be made and things had to be documented. And, that was something that I didn't want crossing my desk, in terms of reviewing these types of calls and being solely responsible for making an individual judgment as to the risk involved. Obviously, none of us have that crystal ball and we can't predict the future. I'll tell you, I grew up in the post Columbine world, and you watch, the news today, and it seems like there's a school shooting, a workplace shooting on a daily or weekly basis. So when our employees started getting, these types of threats, we knew that we had to have some SOPs in place to handle the situation.
Yeah, that's crazy. It's just something you think about. Um, so, yeah, without kind of divulging all the stuff that went into the threat matrix, what are some of the maybe the high level topics or ideas that you guys talked about when kind of building out this kind of like SOP for what score does things need to get to before we realize like 911 is the number that we need to call?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, for us, the most important thing and the one that we, struggled with, and this goes back to our discussion in November about, real-time data or real-time solutions was, how do we, as a management team, how do we review this stuff quickly? This can't be something where our managers, are notified, it goes to an email box and it sits there for a couple days until, an executive or a management level person has the time, to review a phone call. These are situations that really need to be evaluated in real time. So what we did was we set up a team, and it over the years typically had 4 to 5 different management team members, and we created a process where if an individual agent had one of these experiences, they were required to immediately tell their manager. The manager was required to pull the phone call, review it, and immediately send it to those on this team. And then those that were on the team were required to essentially stop what they were doing. If you're in the middle of a project, if you were in the middle of a meeting, kind of excuse yourself, review the call. And we had a shared document where we would put certain data points in, such as the location of the customer, the nature of the threat, whether it was a customer or a prospect or a lead. There are a bunch of variables, that went into kind of the calculus as to what we needed to do next. And I can tell you that, the first time that we decided that we needed to contact local law enforcement, it kind of changed the analysis, because law enforcement was required to jump in. They came out to our site. We had bomb sniffing dogs. We had the robots with the little wands go through.
Yeah.
We had to evacuate 300 or 400 people from our workplace. And obviously we lost hours of productivity. So our team was like, how do we make these decisions? Because every time we get an incident, we can't have this happen, but we also need to, protect our employees and make sure that we're documenting these types of incidents.
Yeah. So let's, I just want to back up. I want to backtrack just a little bit and then kind of dive into that business element. So that system was relying upon kind of an agent self-report of a situation. Was there ever situations where like agents maybe didn't take it seriously, didn't self-report something, and then it was found out about after? Was there some type of like, I guess, how do you drive that behavior at an agent level to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do in situations like that?
No, that's a great question, and frankly, that was where we had some struggles, and I thought about looking at abstract for kind of a solution to this real time problem, because we can train our agents. When X, Y, or Z happens, this is what the process is, but every agent interprets things differently. And, there are times where an agent, gets a customer who's making a threat, and it might be a legal threat, but it's not a safety threat. I'm gonna sue you. I'm gonna get my attorney. I'm gonna, go to the Better Business Bureau, the State Department of Insurance. All of those are threats to the business, but they're not ones that we want to be involved in real time. I'm going to come to your house and shoot you. I'm going to come to the building and cause a fire. I've already put a bomb in the building, and if you don't believe me, this is the address of the building. Those are the ones that we needed to be notified about in real time. So our discussion was, is there a solution out there where we could maybe, key in some red flag or some danger words, and maybe get some sort of a notification or some sort of a ping, to a group of people that basically says you had an agent on the phone with a customer, and these words or this phrasing was used, and this is something you might want to look at quickly.
So outside of software, right? Like again, the agent behavior piece is something because like I used to cold call in a previous life, and people would be like, "You call me one more time, I'm gonna find you and kill you." And I'm like, "Dude, you're in England. Like, you're not coming over to California. Like, you're not gonna do that, right?" So like, how do you drive that incentive or that's what I'm really curious about, Aaron. And again, if you want to go too deep in that, I totally get it. How do you objective? Here's when you do this. If you don't do this, you're going to get fired or written up. Like, how do you make sure nothing slips through the cracks? Because like, you're not messing around in this type of stuff. Like, you don't want people like misunderstanding or using their own applying their own level of subjectivity to a threat that might be very, very real.
Right. No, it's a difficult issue to work through. Obviously, it starts with training. It starts with having all of your employees know what's acceptable and what's not acceptable on a phone call. In your scenario, if you're cold calling or telemarketing a prospect and somebody says, I'm going to come, find you, and they're 10 states away, maybe that doesn't put fear into a particular agent. But we've had some agents where, they were legitimately scared. And what we have to look at from a business perspective is, there's consequences to allowing this type of behavior for our employees. These situations are serious. Third-party harassment can have major consequences. It could lead to EEOC charges and complaints of workplace violations. It could lead to legal claims, and we need to find a way to put safety before sales.
Yeah. So let's kind of transition to the business side, right? You talked about having to take 300, 400 people off the phone. I mean, that's tens of thousands of dollars, right? Potentially, depending upon kind of the size of the transaction, or if it's a support motion, right? Like you're missing your SLAs for customers. If I'm taking hundreds of agents out of a building, how do you look at building in like a backup process to that with like a remote at-home workforce that you can kind of transition the load to? Like, how do you go about trying to build in some redundancy or backup in the event that you need to take everybody out, pull the bomb sniffing dogs in?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and the first experience that we dealt with um, was in a pre-COVID world, and our company was a on-site, on-office company. We did not have work-from-home agents at that time, and it was a major problem for the business because once law enforcement comes out, you're not getting back in your building until they've cleared things, and it takes hours, and certainly large sums of money are lost, depending on the product, tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars lost in sales, lost in customer contact. So yeah, I mean, we thought about that post COVID, because we did shift obviously during COVID to work from home, and we built some protections in there with some remote agents, but it's still a very challenging situation for a company that works on site.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. What what are maybe like the two or three things, Aaron, where you guys looked at these as like criteria met, criteria met, criteria met, of like, yep, this makes sense to pull everybody off, and this is actionable. Like this is actionable intelligence. This is real. What were some of those things that you looked at to justify the business loss?
Yeah, I think that some of the factors that were important to us were proximity.
Okay.
So, for instance, we sold a product and administered a product throughout the country. We were based in St. Petersburg, Florida. If a customer is making a threat and they live within a 30 or 50-mile radius of our office, obviously that has a heightened sense of alert than, like in your scenario, if we have a customer who's in California or Nevada who says, I'm coming right over to the building.
See you
you
in
know
4 days, buddy.
yeah, the
Like,
first flight's in a few hours and a 6-hour flight. So,
yeah.
proximity was a big factor.
Okay.
Really the nature of what was said, and that takes a little bit of finesse and a little bit of experience to really gauge, you know, the difference between, what is a disgruntled customer who's just really unhappy with a level of service or product and is really just saying things out of frustration, versus what is a legitimate threat to somebody's safety. And I'm not going to pretend that there's, a magic formula that we can put into the computer and spit out, because we don't know what's going to happen. But in my position, what we really wanted to do was make sure that everything was documented, because nobody wants to play Monday morning quarterback with this type of stuff after the fact.
Yeah, it reminds me of a book from Gavin DeBecker called The Gift of Fear, and it talks about like
Mm-hmm.
trust. Like as humans, we've evolved to have like this gut feeling of like when things are not going to go right or when you should be scared of things. And so, was there ever an element where you kind of looked at the objective data points, but then maybe you looked at like, I'm hearing this in this call, my gut's telling me this is legit. Like, who can make that call within an organization? Where like the objective stuff, maybe, but I'm listening to this. This dude sounds like he's nuts. We've checked his Facebook profile. He's got this, and this post. Like, evolution's taught me this dude's not messing around.
Yeah, I think one of the important elements that we built into the process, we're all humans and we're trying to guess at, human action, which is really difficult to do. We thought it was important to not have one person being solely responsible for that decision. So that's why we built a 4 or 5 person team, and everybody had to kind of weigh in. And what that does is allows people to be a little bit more candid with their thoughts, because it's not solely on them. Whatever action is going to be taken or not going to be taken has some sort of group consensus behind it. And we thought that was an important element of it. To kind of address the beginning of your question, and one that maybe we didn't nail correctly the first time, was the first time that we had a customer come into our call center, visited us at our location with a fender of an automobile slung over his shoulder, which is probably 10 to
4 or 5 feet, yeah.
12, yards wide, carrying a large, sharp piece of metal over his shoulder into his office. And obviously we realized quickly that we needed to have a good process in place for security, both on site and by phone, because that guy did not seem to have the best intentions.
Yeah. So when you talk about like group, so without going down the rabbit hole of like psychology, like group think's a real thing, right? And so it instantly reminded me of World War Z, where Israel was prepared for the zombie attack by following the 11th man kind of rule, where if 10 people agree, the 11th person has to disagree with them. And it always kind of resulted in them kind of coming up with what if scenarios that the original 10 couldn't come up with. And so, like, wouldn't that, the 5 people, right? Like, you have to have strong, dominant, like, not willing to just back down type of people on that team, because you don't want to ever get in a position where you have 4 or 5 amiable people that all just don't want to disagree with each other, so they all come to the same conclusion.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And I guess to touch on one other, point of that was this wasn't a jury vote or a majority wins. It wasn't, 3 people think that a situation is benign or low risk and 2 people view it as high risk. So the 3 dominate the 2 and win. This was a 4 or 5 people at a table. And, I want to give you the exact number, but it wasn't a majority decision.
Oh, got it. Cool. Well, this has been my favorite podcast, Aaron. This is like real world, not messing around stuff, right? This isn't just like, did we answer the phone in 7 seconds, or did we resolve a complaint the first time around? Like, this is people's lives, and real threat. So I appreciate you sharing a lot of this. When you get into the nitty gritty, right? Like, I'm sure there's a lot of details that go into stuff like this, but even at a high level, I think there's a lot of actionable stuff here, Aaron. So I appreciate you sharing it with us today.
Awesome. I appreciate you guys having me. This was fun.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to talking again in the future. And if any of our listeners want to reach out to Aaron, we'll include all of his stuff, LinkedIn, how to reach Aaron in our in the posting of the podcast. So thank you for your time, Aaron.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg.
Bye.